On a quiet Tuesday night in the heart of Manhattan, the restaurant breathed in low golden light, the kind that made crystal glasses glow and secrets feel heavier. A grand piano stood at the center of the room, polished to perfection, untouched, like something sacred no one dared disturb. Clara Whitmore moved through the space with quiet precision, balancing plates, refilling water, never drawing attention. She was the kind of waitress people forgot the moment they looked away, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Still, every time she passed the piano, something in her slowed, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to matter. The room carried the soft clink of silverware, the murmur of deals, the faint hum of wealth that never needed to prove itself. Then the doors opened. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted, bending toward a single presence entering without hurry. Alexander Pierce didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, because the room adjusted around him like gravity had changed. His suit was tailored charcoal, his watch understated but worth more than most people's yearly salary, and his gaze moved across the room with quiet ownership. He took his seat without asking, the best table already waiting, and Clara was assigned to him before she could say otherwise. She approached with the same calm rhythm, pen ready, posture perfect, eyes steady but distant. He barely looked at her when he ordered, listing items like commands, his attention already elsewhere. To him, she was part of the machinery, nothing more. Clara nodded, wrote, turned, and left without a word. Behind her, laughter rose from his table, sharp, expensive, careless. Minutes passed in quiet repetition, service flowing, until a guest near the piano joked about music, about how no one in the city played like the old masters anymore. The comment drifted, light at first, then caught by Alexander. He leaned back, a smile forming, the kind that always meant trouble. His eyes landed on Clara as she passed again, and this time he actually saw her, not as a person, but as an opportunity for amusement. "You," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Clara stopped, turning slowly, her expression unchanged. "Do you play?" he asked, nodding toward the piano. A few heads turned. She shook her head once, a simple answer. The smile widened. "Play the piano, and I'll marry you," he said, laughter already building before anyone else joined. It spread quickly, rippling across the room, turning her into a moment, a joke, something disposable. Clara didn't respond. She didn't defend, didn't smile, didn't look down. She just stood there, still as the piano behind her. For a second, the noise felt distant, like it belonged to another room. Then she reached up, slowly, and removed her gloves, folding them with deliberate care. The laughter softened, curiosity replacing it in small increments. She turned toward the piano, each step measured, unhurried, as if nothing in the world had changed. The bench creaked softly as she sat, her hands hovering above the keys for just a breath. Then the first note fell, clear, precise, undeniable. It didn't ask for attention, it took it, threading through every conversation until nothing else could exist. Heads turned fully now, conversations dying, glasses pausing midair. The melody grew, expanding, rising into something intricate, something impossible to fake. Alexander didn't laugh this time. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, watching not a waitress, but a revelation unfolding in front of him. The room held its breath as the music climbed, and for the first time that night, power shifted without a word. If you think this is where the story ends, stay with me, because what happens next will change everything, and you won't want to miss it. So make sure you subscribe and follow for more stories like this. Now let's go back to our main character Clara Whitmore, as the music continues to unfold around her in a room that is no longer the same place it was minutes ago. Because everything has already begun to change in ways no one. The final note did not end when it should have. It lingered in the air, like a question no one in the room knew how to answer. And Clara Whitmore did not rush to fill that silence. She let it stretch, let it settle over polished glass and tailored suits, over people who were suddenly unsure where to look or how to react. And then, with the same quiet control she had shown all night, she lowered her hands from the keys and stood, not bowing, not acknowledging the room, just returning to herself as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had, because Alexander Pierce was no longer leaning back in amusement. He was sitting forward now, elbows on the table, his eyes fixed on her with something dangerously close to focus, the kind he reserved for negotiations worth millions. And yet this was different. This was not about money. This was about being wrong in a room where he had never been wrong before. Clara turned, her expression calm, and walked back toward his table, each step measured, unaffected by the weight of every gaze following her. She picked up the leather folder she had set aside earlier, opened it with steady hands, and placed it in front of him. "Your bill, sir," she said, her voice even, professional, unchanged, as if the last 3 minutes had not redefined the atmosphere of the entire restaurant. A flicker passed through his expression, not anger, not quite admiration, something sharper, something calculating. He glanced down at the bill but did not reach for it immediately. Instead, his eyes lifted back to her, studying her face as if searching for the explanation he had just been denied. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, and this time his voice was lower. Stripped of the careless arrogance it carried before, Clara did not hesitate. "I did not learn here," she replied, which was not an answer, not really. But it was all she offered, and for a moment that was enough to hold him in place. Around them, the room began to breathe again. Conversations restarting in fragments, whispers replacing laughter, the story already forming in the corners of the night. But Alexander Pierce was not done. He reached for his card slowly, placing it inside the folder, his movements deliberate, controlled, as if re-establishing the order he was used to. Clara waited, still, composed, giving nothing away. When he signed the receipt, he paused, pen hovering for just a second before writing something extra beneath the total. Then he closed the folder and slid it toward her. Their fingers did not touch, but the space between them felt charged with something unspoken. She picked it up, nodded once, and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her again. "Clara," he said, and this time he used her name like he had always known it, not as a convenience, but as a fact he had decided mattered. She turned back, just enough to meet his eyes. "Yes, sir," she answered. And there it was again, that calm, that distance, that refusal to step into the role he had tried to assign her. He leaned back slightly, watching her in a way that suggested the evening was no longer entertainment. It was a problem he intended to solve. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. The same chair his guests had occupied minutes ago, the same space that carried the weight of power and expectation. A few nearby tables fell quiet again, sensing the shift. Clara looked at the chair, then back at him, and for the first time there was the smallest pause, not uncertainty, but consideration, the kind that came from someone who understood exactly what accepting that invitation would mean. She could feel the room waiting, the subtle pull of curiosity pressing in from every direction, but she did not move immediately. Instead, she placed the folder against her chest, her posture unchanged. "I am working, sir," she said, gently, not as a refusal, but as a boundary, and something in his expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition, as if he had just encountered a rule he could not simply override. He smiled then, but it was different now, quieter, edged with respect he had not intended to give. "Then I will wait," he replied, as if time itself was something he could command into stillness. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, turning away again. But this time the story did not follow him, it followed her, as she moved back into the rhythm of the restaurant, carrying trays, answering calls, becoming invisible once more, except she was not invisible anymore, not to him, and not to anyone who had heard what she had just done. And somewhere beneath the surface of that quiet control, something older, something carefully buried, had begun to stir again, because moments like this did not happen by accident, and Alexander Pierce was not the kind of man who let mysteries remain unsolved, which meant this night was not ending. It was only just beginning, and what he would uncover next would go far beyond a piano in a dimly lit room. The rhythm of the restaurant returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm Clara Whitmore had moved through for months, because now every glance lingered half a second longer. Every whisper carried her name in fragments she pretended not to hear, and yet she continued as she always had, refilling glasses before they were empty, clearing plates the moment a fork rested, her movements precise, efficient, invisible in form but no longer in presence. And across the room Alexander Pierce watched, not constantly, not obviously, but with a consistency that revealed something deeper than curiosity. It was assessment, the same quiet calculation he used when acquiring companies, when identifying leverage, when deciding whether something was worth pursuing or discarding entirely. Except Clara did not fit into any category he understood, and that unsettled him in a way he had not felt in years. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour, his table long cleared, his guests gone, but he remained, a single figure in a room that was slowly emptying. His untouched second drink catching the dim light as if marking time. Clara noticed, of course she did. She noticed everything. But she gave no indication, no acknowledgement, because whatever this was, it was not something she intended to engage on his terms. And yet when her manager approached her quietly near the service station, his voice low and urgent, "Table 12 is still yours," she understood the implication. This was no longer a standard interaction. This was a decision point. She nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she had already decided how this would unfold. When she returned to his table, he did not look up immediately, his attention fixed on the empty chair across from him, as if considering it, measuring it. And then he spoke without lifting his gaze. "You finished your shift." It was not a question, it was an assumption, one that would normally be correct. Clara set a fresh glass of water in front of him, the condensation catching the light. "Not yet," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that shifted the balance again, a quiet refusal to be placed into his expected timeline. He finally looked at her then, fully, and there was no laughter left in his expression, only focus. "Sit," he said again, softer this time, less command, more request, but still edged with expectation. Clara stood still for a moment. Then, without urgency, she moved the chair slightly with her foot and sat, not leaning forward, not leaning back, simply present, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, and the air between them changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that would be impossible to ignore if anyone were close enough to feel it. "You are not a waitress," he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what he had already concluded. Clara's gaze did not shift. "I am tonight," she answered. And again, it was not an explanation. It was a boundary. He exhaled slowly, a faint smile forming, not amused, but intrigued. "People do not play like that by accident," he continued. "People do not disappear into rooms like this by accident either." His words were deliberate, probing, searching for a reaction, a crack, anything that would confirm a direction. Clara tilted her head just slightly, considering him, not his question, but him. "And yet," she said quietly, "you are still here." The statement landed with more weight than its simplicity suggested, because it implied something he had not yet admitted to himself, that he was the one being drawn into something unknown, not the other way around. He leaned back then, studying her again, but differently now, as if recalibrating the entire framework through which he understood the moment. "I do not like unfinished stories," he said. And there it was, the closest thing to honesty he had offered all night. Clara's expression softened by a fraction, not warmth, not openness, just recognition. "Then you should not interrupt them," she replied. And before he could respond, she stood, the movement smooth, controlled, ending the conversation not with dismissal, but with finality. She adjusted the chair back into place, aligning it perfectly with the table, as if restoring order to something he had attempted to disrupt. And then she stepped away, returning once more to the quiet current of the room, leaving him alone again, but not in the same way as before, because now the silence around him was not empty. It was filled with something unresolved, something that did not yield to money, status, or demand. And as he watched her disappear into the background once more, he realized for the first time that whatever this was, it was not a game he controlled. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of his certainty, something unfamiliar began to take shape. Something that felt dangerously like anticipation for what would happen the next time their paths crossed by the time the last guest drifted out into the cool Manhattan night. The restaurant had returned to its quiet skeleton, the golden light dimmed, chairs reset, glasses polished back into silence. But Clara Whitmore was still moving through it, finishing the final details of her shift with the same steady precision she had maintained all evening. as if nothing significant had taken place, as if the room had not shifted around her in ways that would echo long after the doors closed. And yet there was a subtle difference now, not in her actions, but in the awareness. Beneath them, because she knew, without needing to look, that Alexander Pierce had not left when he should have. She could feel it the way one feels a storm before it breaks, quiet, contained, but present. And sure enough, when she stepped into the service corridor to return a tray, she found him there, not seated, not commanding, simply standing, his jacket draped over one arm. His posture relaxed in a way that did not match the intensity in his eyes. He had moved out of the main room, away from the audience. And that alone changed the rules. Clara paused, just for a fraction of a second, then continued forward as if he were just another guest lingering too long. But as she passed, his voice cut through the narrow space, softer than before, but more direct. "You are avoiding me," he said, and this time there was no audience to perform for, no laughter to hide behind, only the truth of the moment hanging between them. Clara set the tray down on a nearby counter, aligning it carefully before turning to face him fully. "No," she replied, her tone calm. "I am finishing my work." And again, it was not a defense. It was a boundary, one he was beginning to recognize but not yet accept. He stepped slightly closer, not invading her space, but reducing the distance enough to make the conversation intentional. "People like you do not stay in places like this," he said, his voice carrying that same analytical edge, but now it was tempered with something else, something closer to curiosity than judgment. Clara did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched him, not with challenge, but with clarity, as if measuring what he was really asking. And when she spoke, her words were simple, but precise. "People like you assume they understand places like this," she said. And for a moment, that was enough to stop him, not because it was aggressive, but because it was accurate in a way he could not easily dismiss. He exhaled, a faint, almost reluctant smile touching his expression. "Then help me understand," he said, and this time there was no command in it, no expectation, just a quiet request that hung in the space between them. Clara considered him for a long second, the silence stretching just enough to make the moment feel deliberate. And then she shook her head once, not dismissive, not cold, simply final. "That is not my job," she replied, and before he could respond, she reached for her coat, slipping it over her shoulders with the same composed movement she brought to everything else, signaling that whatever this was, it was not continuing on his terms. He watched her, not frustrated, not impatient, but more focused than before, as if each answer she gave only deepened the question rather than resolving it. "Then what is your job, Clara?" he asked, and this time her name carried a different weight, not casual, not assumed, but chosen. She paused with her hand on the door, glancing back at him, and for the first time that night, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not vulnerability, but something close to honesty. "To leave when the work is done," she said quietly, and with that, she opened the door and stepped out into the night, the cool air wrapping around her like a reset, the city alive in a way the restaurant could never be. She did not look back. She did not hesitate. She simply walked, disappearing into the rhythm of the street the same way she had once disappeared into the rhythm of the room. But behind her, Alexander Pierce remained where he was, standing in that narrow corridor, watching the space she had just left as if it might still hold the answer he was looking for. And for the first time in a long time, he did not move to control the situation. He did not make a call. He did not give an order, because something about this encounter had shifted the equation in a way he could not immediately solve. And that, more than anything, ensured that this would not be the last time their paths crossed, because men like him did not walk away from mysteries. They followed them, no matter where they led. And somewhere ahead in the quiet chaos of the city, Clara Whitmore was already becoming exactly that. The city did not slow for Clara Whitmore. It never had. And that was exactly why she had chosen it. Because in a place where millions of lives moved without noticing each other, it was easier to disappear, easier to exist without explanation. And as she walked down the dimly lit street, the echo of the piano still faint in her memory, her pace remained steady, controlled, untouched by the weight of what had just happened. She turned the corner onto a quieter block, the noise of traffic softening into a distant hum, and slipped into a narrow apartment building that looked like every other on the street. Unremarkable, forgettable. The kind of place no one would associate with anything extraordinary, and sighed. The hallway lights flickered faintly, the air carrying the scent of old wood and something worn with time. She climbed the stairs without hesitation, each step familiar, each movement routine, until she reached her door, unlocked it, and stepped into a space that was as precise and controlled as she was, small but ordered, nothing unnecessary, nothing personal left out for the world to see. Except one thing. In the corner of the room, partially covered with a simple cloth, stood an upright piano, older than the one in the restaurant. Its wood faded, its edges worn, but intact, preserved, and as Clara closed the door behind her, the quiet of the room settled around her in a way that the restaurant never could. She removed her coat, placed it neatly on the chair, and for a moment, she did nothing, just stood there, as if allowing the silence to reset something inside her. Then, slowly, she crossed the room and pulled the cloth back, revealing the keys beneath. Her fingers hovered above them, not touching, not yet, because this was not the same as before. This was not performance. This was memory. And when she finally pressed a key, the sound was softer, more intimate, carrying something the grand piano never could, something personal, something unguarded. The melody that followed was not flawless, not designed to impress. It was deliberate, careful, like someone revisiting a language they had once spoken fluently but had chosen to forget, each note pulling something deeper to the surface, something she had kept buried beneath routines and silence. And miles away, in a penthouse that overlooked the same restless city, Alexander Pierce stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, the skyline reflecting in the glass as he held a thin folder in his hand. It had taken less than an hour for his assistant to send it, because when he decided to look into something, it was never a casual inquiry. It was thorough, precise, efficient. But this time, the file was thinner than expected, almost empty, and that alone was enough to irritate him. Because there were always records, always traces. People did not simply exist without leaving something behind. Yet Clara Whitmore had, at least on the surface, a name, an address, employment records. Nothing remarkable, nothing that explained what he had seen. He flipped through the pages again, slower this time, as if something might reveal itself if he looked hard enough. But it did not. And for the first time that night, frustration edged into his expression. Not because he lacked information, but because what he had was incomplete, and incomplete was unacceptable. He set the folder down on the glass table, his reflection staring back at him with the same sharp certainty he had always carried. But beneath it, something had shifted, something subtle, something that made this less about control and more about understanding. And that was unfamiliar territory. He reached for his phone, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then dialed, his voice calm, measured. "I want everything," he said, not raising his tone, not needing to. "Education, history, connections, anything that does not show up in a standard report." There was a pause on the other end, a quiet acknowledgement, and then the line went dead. He placed the phone down, his gaze returning to the city, but his thoughts were no longer on the skyline. They were on a dimly lit restaurant, a grand piano, and a woman who had turned a moment of mockery into something he could not explain. And across the city, Clara's hands slowed on the worn keys, the final notes settling into the quiet of her apartment. She exhaled softly, her fingers resting against the surface as if grounding herself. And for the first time since she had left the restaurant, her expression shifted, not into relief, not into regret, but into something more complex, something that acknowledged the inevitability of what had just begun, because moments like that did not disappear. They did not fade into routine. They changed trajectories, whether she wanted them to or not. And as she covered the piano once more, restoring it to silence, she understood something with quiet certainty, that the man she had left standing in that corridor was not the kind of man who would forget, and that meant the next move, whatever it was, would not come from her, but it would come soon, and when it did, it would not be something she could simply walk away from again. Morning arrived in Manhattan without ceremony, the city already in motion before the sun fully claimed the skyline, and Clara Whitmore stepped into it with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. Her uniform pressed, her expression composed, her presence once again dissolving into the background of a world that did not pause to notice individuals unless they demanded it. And she never did. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was unchanged on the surface: polished glass, measured voices, the same carefully curated illusion of effortless luxury. But beneath it, there was a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable to those who paid attention. And Clara noticed everything. She noticed the way her manager watched her a little longer than usual, the way a colleague hesitated before speaking as if unsure how to address her now, the way a few early guests glanced at her with faint recognition they could not quite place. The story from the night before had not disappeared. It had simply settled into the fabric of the space. And as she moved through her tasks, she maintained the same rhythm, refusing to acknowledge the change, because acknowledging it would give it weight, and weight was something she had learned to avoid. But the morning would not remain ordinary for long, because at exactly 11:15, a black car stopped outside the restaurant. Not flashy, not loud, but precise, intentional. And when the door opened, Alexander Pierce stepped out with the same controlled presence he had carried the night before. Except this time there was no audience waiting, no curated performance, only daylight and clarity. Inside, the manager straightened instinctively, the staff adjusting in small, automatic ways, and Clara, standing near the service station, did not turn immediately. She did not react, but she felt it, the shift in the air, the same one from the night before, and when she finally looked, their eyes met across the room for a fraction of a second, long enough to confirm what she already knew. He had not let it go. He walked in without hesitation, taking a seat at the same table as if it had been reserved without needing to ask, his gaze not leaving her as she approached, and when she reached him, her voice was steady, unchanged. "Good morning, sir," she said, and there was no trace of recognition in her tone, no acknowledgement of what had passed between them, only professionalism, only distance. He watched her for a moment before responding, as if measuring whether she would break first. "I am not here for breakfast," he said, and the statement hung between them with quiet implication. Clara nodded once, her pen poised but unmoving. "Then what can I get for you?" she asked. And there it was again, the boundary, the refusal to step outside the role he had tried to redefine. He leaned back slightly, studying her in the clearer light of day, where everything was easier to see, yet somehow less revealing. "Information," he said simply, and a few nearby staff members slowed their movements. Sensing the tension without fully understanding it, Clara's expression did not change. "I do not provide that," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. He exhaled, a faint hint of amusement returning. But it was quieter now, more controlled. "Everyone provides something," he said, and for the first time, there was a slight edge to his tone, not frustration, but persistence. Clara placed a glass of water in front of him, the same precise movement as always. "Then you should ask the right person," she said, and turned to leave. But his voice stopped her again, not louder, but sharper. "I already did," he said, and she paused, just briefly, before turning back, and in that moment, something shifted, not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the space between them, because she understood what he was saying without needing clarification. He had looked, he had searched, and he had not found what he expected, and that was not something men like him accepted easily. Their eyes held for a second longer this time. And in that silence, there was a recognition, not of identity, but of intent. He was not here for answers he could buy. He was here for answers she might refuse to give. And that made this something else entirely, something that no longer belonged to the controlled environment of the restaurant, but to something deeper, something unresolved. And as Clara broke the gaze and stepped away once more, returning to her work with the same steady rhythm, she knew that whatever line had been crossed the night before had not been erased by daylight. It had only become clearer, and Alexander Pierce, seated alone at that table, watching her move through the room as if nothing had changed, realized something with a certainty he rarely questioned. This was no longer about a piano, or a moment, or even a mystery. This was about a pattern he could not predict, and that was the one thing he had never been able to ignore, which meant he was not leaving. Not today, and not until something in this carefully controlled equation finally revealed itself. Because some silences were not empty, they were deliberate, and Clara Whitmore was beginning to look exactly like one of them. The tension did not break. It deepened, settling into the quiet structure of the day like something that refused to be dismissed. And Clara Whitmore moved through it with the same measured precision. Her actions unchanged, her expression composed. But beneath that calm there was awareness, not fear, not hesitation, just awareness. Because she understood the nature of persistence when it came from men like Alexander Pierce. It was not loud. It was not chaotic. It was controlled, deliberate. And it did not stop until it reached its conclusion. And across the room he remained, not checking his watch, not making calls, simply observing, as if time itself had become irrelevant to the outcome he was pursuing. Hours passed in quiet repetition, the lunch service rising and falling, guests arriving and leaving. But he stayed, a constant presence that shifted the rhythm of the room without ever raising his voice. And eventually the manager approached Clara again, his tone careful. "He has been here for 3 hours, he said, as if that alone explained everything. Clara nodded once, not surprised, not concerned, just acknowledging what she already knew. And when she returned to the table, Alexander did not look up immediately, his gaze fixed on the city beyond the window. But he spoke before she could. "You are very good at waiting," he said, and there was something almost reflective in the way he said it. Clara placed a fresh napkin beside his untouched glass. "It is part of the job," she replied, and he smiled faintly, not amused, but recognizing the pattern. "No," he said quietly, turning his attention back to her. "It is not." And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching into something more intentional than before. Because this was no longer about surface exchanges. It was about pressure, about who would step beyond the line first, and Clara understood that. Which was why she did not step at all. She remained exactly where she was, within the boundaries she had drawn from the beginning. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because it removed the leverage he was accustomed to using. Finally, he reached into his jacket and placed something on the table, a thin envelope, unmarked, deliberate. "I do not like incomplete information," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "And I do not believe in coincidence." Clara's eyes moved to the envelope. But she did not touch it, did not ask, did not react. He continued. "You have a record that says nothing, a history that explains nothing, and a skill that does not belong in this room." His words were not accusatory. They were precise, each one placed carefully, like pieces of a puzzle he was assembling in real time. Clara looked at him then, fully, her gaze steady, unguarded in a way that was almost disarming. "Then you already have your answer," she said softly, and for the first time there was a shift in him, not visible to anyone else, but present in the way his expression tightened for just a fraction of a second. Because her response did not close the question, it expanded it, and that was something he was not used to. He leaned back slightly, studying her again. But this time there was less certainty in the way he did it, more consideration. "People hide things for a reason," he said, and Clara's lips curved almost imperceptibly, not a smile, but something close to acknowledgement. "So do people who go looking for them," she replied, and the weight of that statement settled between them in a way neither could ignore, because it suggested something deeper, something that extended beyond curiosity or control, something that hinted at motive. And for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around them, the noise fading, the movement slowing, until it felt as though the entire space existed only within the distance of that table. Alexander's gaze did not waver, but there was a new element in it now, something sharper, something that suggested he was no longer simply observing. He was adjusting, recalibrating, and that was when he made his decision, not announced, not declared, just set into motion. "I will be here tonight," he said, his tone even, final, not asking for permission, not offering explanation, simply stating what would happen next. Clara did not react immediately. She held his gaze for a second longer, long enough to understand what that meant, that this was not ending, that whatever line had been drawn between them was about to be tested again. And then she nodded once, a small, controlled movement that neither accepted nor refused, it simply acknowledged. And with that, she turned and walked away, returning to the rhythm of the room. But this time the rhythm felt different, heavier, more deliberate, because the next moment was no longer uncertain, it was inevitable. And as Alexander Pierce watched her disappear into the flow of the restaurant once more, he understood something with quiet clarity. This was no longer a question of who she was. It was a question of what she would do next, and that was the one variable he could not predict, which meant tonight would not be a repetition of what had already happened. It would be something else entirely, something that would either confirm everything he suspected or dismantle it completely. And either way, he would be there to see it happen. The restaurant did not announce the evening. It transformed into it, the golden light deepening, the reflections sharpening, the quiet hum of wealth returning in measured waves. And Clara Whitmore stepped back into that world as if nothing had shifted, as if the weight of the day had not settled into something inevitable. Her movements were the same, precise, controlled, her presence once again dissolving into the rhythm of service. But beneath that calm there was clarity, not anticipation, not hesitation, just clarity, because she understood what tonight represented, not a continuation, but a test, and tests, unlike conversations, required decisions. At exactly 7:30, the door opened, and Alexander Pierce entered without pause, without spectacle, yet the room adjusted around him all the same. The subtle shift in attention, the quiet recalibration of space. He took his seat at the same table, the same position, as if repeating a pattern that demanded resolution. But this time there was no laughter, no casual arrogance, only focus. And when Clara approached, there was no greeting exchanged, no pretense of routine, just a moment of silence that carried more weight than any words could have. She placed a glass of water in front of him, the condensation catching the light, and he washed her hands, not the gesture, but the control behind it. "You knew I would come back," he said, his voice low, steady, and Clara did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She simply met his gaze for a fraction of a second before stepping back, maintaining the distance she had held from the beginning. And that was when he made the move he had decided hours before. He reached into his jacket and placed the envelope from earlier on the table, sliding it toward her. But this time it was not a symbol, it was an offer. "Everything that is missing," he said, "is in there." His tone carried no arrogance, no expectation, just a statement. Clara looked at the envelope, not with curiosity, but with recognition. She did not touch it, did not ask what it contained, because she already understood. It was leverage, information, a constructed version of truth designed to draw a response. And for a moment, the space between them held completely still, the surrounding noise fading into something distant. Because this was the moment where the pattern could either repeat or break. Slowly, deliberately, Clara reached forward, not to take the envelope, but to slide it back toward him, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged. "You are looking in the wrong place," she said softly, and there was no challenge in her voice, no defiance, only certainty. And for the first time since he had walked in, Alexander did not immediately respond, because her refusal was not emotional. It was precise. It dismantled the premise of what he had brought without needing to argue against it. He leaned back slightly, studying her again, but now there was something else in his gaze, not just curiosity, but respect, measured, reluctant, but undeniable. "Then show me the right one," he said, and the words carried weight, not because of what they asked, but because of what they implied, that he was willing, for the first time, to step outside the framework he controlled. Clara's eyes held his for a second longer than before, and in that silence, something shifted again, something deeper than before, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about choice, and Clara Whitmore had spent a long time avoiding choices that led backward. But some moments did not allow avoidance. They required action, without another word. She turned, not toward the exit, not toward the service station, but toward the center of the room, toward the grand piano that had remained untouched since the night before. The movement was subtle, but it carried through the space like a signal. Conversations softened, attention shifted, and even those who did not understand why found themselves watching. Clara reached the piano, her hand resting lightly against its polished surface for a brief second, as if acknowledging something unspoken, and then she sat, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. Alexander did not move, but his focus sharpened, because this was not repetition, this was something else, something deliberate. Clara's fingers hovered above the keys, and for a moment, there was complete silence, the kind that does not feel empty, but charged, and then she began to play, but not the way she had before. This was not performance, not demonstration. The melody was different, slower, layered with something heavier, something that carried memory instead of precision, each note unfolding like a story that did not need explanation. And as the sound filled the room, the atmosphere shifted again, not into shock, but into something deeper, something that demanded attention without asking for it. And Alexander Pierce, sitting alone at his table, realized that this was not about skill, it was about meaning, and whatever she was choosing to reveal in that moment was not something he could analyze or reduce. It was something he had to witness, and as the music rose, carrying something unspoken into the space between them, he understood with quiet certainty that whatever answer he had come looking for was no longer in the envelope. It was here, in front of him, unfolding one note at a time, and whether he understood it or not, it was about to change everything again. The final note did not rush to its conclusion. It lingered, stretching across the room like something unwilling to be confined to a single moment, and Clara Whitmore let it exist exactly as it was, unforced, unresolved, because this time the music was not meant to impress. It was meant to reveal, not to the room, not to the audience, but to the one person who had insisted on searching for answers where they did not belong. And when her hands finally lifted from the keys, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not shock. It was understanding, quiet, incomplete, but present. Clara remained seated for a second longer, her gaze lowered, as if acknowledging something only she could fully see. And then she stood, turning back toward the room with the same composed control she had never lost. But something had shifted, not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the weight she carried, as if a decision had been made that could not be undone. Across the room, Alexander Pierce did not move, he did not speak, because for the first time since this began, he was not trying to analyze what he had witnessed, he was experiencing it. And that, more than anything, changed the dynamic between them. Clara walked back toward his table, her steps steady, her presence once again quiet but undeniable. She stopped just short of the chair across from him, not sitting, not leaning in, simply standing within the space they had created together. "You wanted to understand," she said softly, her voice carrying no challenge, no distance, just clarity. Alexander met her gaze, and for a moment, there was no arrogance left in his expression, no calculation, only focus. "I still do," he replied, and this time it was not a demand. It was an admission. Clara nodded once, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided long before this moment. "Then you need to stop looking for explanations," she said, and the simplicity of her words carried a weight that did not need elaboration, because it was not information he lacked, it was perspective, and that was something no file, no report, no investigation could provide. He leaned back slightly, absorbing that, not resisting it, not dismissing it, but considering it in a way he rarely allowed himself to. "And what happens if I do?" he asked quietly, and Clara's expression softened, just enough to reveal something human beneath the control. "Then you might start to see things as they are, not as you expect them to be," she answered, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them holding something unspoken, something unresolved, but no longer confrontational, because the balance had shifted in a way that did not require force, only recognition. Finally, Clara stepped back, breaking the moment not abruptly, but naturally, as if it had reached its end without needing to be declared. She picked up the bill folder from the table, placing it gently in front of him. "Your check, sir," she said, her tone returning to its original form, calm, professional, complete. Alexander looked at it, then back at her, and for the first time, a faint smile appeared, not the sharp, amused version from before, but something quieter, more genuine, as if he had accepted something he did not fully understand, but no longer needed to control. He signed without hesitation, closing the folder and sliding it back toward her, and when she took it, their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, not intentional, not emphasized, but enough to register, enough to mark the end of something that had never been clearly defined. Clara nodded once, turning away, returning to the rhythm of the room that had never truly stopped. But as she moved, she was no longer invisible, not to him, and not to the story that had unfolded between them. Alexander remained seated for a moment longer, watching her as she disappeared into the flow of service. But this time, he did not follow. He did not call her back. He did not demand more, because something had shifted in him as well, something that did not require immediate resolution. He stood, adjusting his jacket, and walked toward the exit without looking back, the door closing behind him with quiet finality. And outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware of the moment that had just taken place, unaware of the subtle change in two people who would never fully return to who they were before. And inside, Clara Whitmore moved through the restaurant with the same calm precision. But now there was something else beneath it, something settled, something certain, because she had not proven anything. She had not revealed everything. She had simply allowed the truth to exist without explanation. And sometimes that was enough, because not every story ends with answers. Some end with understanding, the kind that cannot be measured or owned, only recognized. And if there is one thing this moment leaves behind, it is this: power does not always belong to the one who speaks the loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the one who knows when silence is enough. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you see things a little differently, then take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need the reminder, because sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one worth listening to the most.